Hi, it's Katrina. My friend David is going to be helping me out with the voiceover today, so I hope you enjoy.
Number 7. The Spanish conquest of the Maya. The Maya civilization may have been well past its peak when the Spanish began to colonize the Americas. But they weren't gone. The Maya still occupied Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador in the 16th century. It's just that they'd abandoned many of their great cities and had devolved into a number of warring kingdoms. For the Spanish conquerors, the Maya were viewed as barbarians, and the Catholics labeled them atheists and believed they should be converted to Catholicism or be annihilated. But despite the obvious achievements of their civilization, the Catholics fought to destroy the Maya. Contact was first made in 1502. Christopher Columbus's brother Bartholomew met a group of Maya paddling their canoe. Then, on a series of expeditions in 1517 and 1519, the Spanish continued to meet Maya groups along the coast of the Yucatan Peninsula. As more and more Spanish arrived, the Maya kingdoms continued to resist integration, and it took almost 200 years for the Spanish to finally subjugate the Maya. There's a good reason why today, Latin America is one of the most hardcore Catholic regions in the world. The campaign to convert the indigenous people was so effective that once it succeeded, there was no turning back. Even after the initial contact by Hernán Cortés with the Itza Maya in 1525, they remained hostile and mostly independent until 1697, when the last independent Maya kingdom was obliterated. But how did the Catholics go about converting the Maya decade after decade? One of their most effective strategies was shifting the native populations into their colonial towns. By doing this, and forcing conversion through threats of violence and brutality, they were able to slowly convert Maya people into Catholics. The reason the fighting went on for so long was that once the easily accessible regions were dominated, the Maya took the fight into the jungle. In the more difficult regions of the forest, the Maya held out much longer against the Spanish. But by 1699, there was very little resistance left. The surviving Maya had been crushed, and their people were forced to resettle in colonial towns. Catholics continued to destroy everything they viewed as heretical, including the Maya codices, which contained the bulk of their knowledge and history. The Spanish made it their mission to erase everything they could about the Mayans' culture, and they didn't stop until every last one of them was Catholic. And now for number 6. But first, I wanted to give a big shout out to Kiran Daredevil 815 and Saltzmans. Thanks so much for watching and supporting OE. And if you're new here, be sure to subscribe and join the family. Number 6. The Heretics of the Inquisition. In the early 1200s, the Holy Inquisition against depraved heresy was established by the Vatican as a way to destroy breakaway Christian groups, but it wasn't particularly powerful until 1481. Almost nobody was burned at the stake for more than 200 years, and it wasn't until Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain established the Inquisition in Seville that things started to get out of control. In the late 15th century, there was a concern among the Spanish royalty that Jews were beginning to exert their influence over their Catholic subjects. The Inquisition was a way for Spain to get rid of the people they didn't want in their country while promoting Catholic values. In the first 30 days that the Inquisition was working, there was a grace period. Anyone who wanted to admit their wrongdoings could receive a small fine and be left alone, after converting to Catholicism, of course. But it was a disaster from the very start. People began to fabricate false evidence against their enemies to receive a reward and to have their enemies killed for heresy. Catholics were given a list of things to watch for. If anyone was seen blessing a child without making the sign of the cross, they were reported. People who fasted on Yom Kippur or worked on the Sabbath were also turned in. And anyone who changed their linens on Friday were handed over to the inquisitors immediately. If someone was caught being Jewish in Spain after 1481, they were considered a heretic and could be burned alive. And if the person didn't confess to their heresy, they were usually tortured until they eventually admitted to their wrongdoing. What a lot of people don't realize about torture during the Inquisition is that no blood was usually spilled. There was a Christian law at the time not to spill blood while torturing a person, so instead people were pulled apart by ropes, drowned or burned. The first official execution was in 1481, and legend has it, the first victim was a woman accused of being possessed by the devil who was allegedly caught laying eggs. The Inquisition traveled around the globe. The Catholics tried desperately to rid themselves of all other religious sects wherever it was possible. The Inquisition spread from Spain to Portugal, then it went to all of their colonies in Cuba, Mexico, Argentina, and India. The Inquisitors were everywhere. It was only abolished in 1834 after 350 years, and by then an estimated 400,000 people were accused of heresy, resulting in almost the entire Jewish population of Spain being kicked out of the country. Number 5. The Catholics in the North. The Spanish weren't the only ones busy spreading the faith in the New World. However, they were preoccupied in Mexico, fighting the Maya and the Aztec. So the Spanish didn't have the resources to spread the word of God all the way up into the northern United States and into what's now Canada. But they did take over Florida. The Spanish founded St. Augustine and murdered the French competition. Then in 1566, Sebastian Montero went on a first Catholic mission to spread Catholicism to the Native American groups in the US. In the 16th century, Florida governors chose Jesuit priests to travel from one Native American group to another. Most of the time, these missions were unsuccessful. The native population was extremely hostile to outsiders and didn't take well to the idea of being converted. But with time and patience came success. There were successful missionaries in Florida, and from there the mission spread into Texas, New Mexico, and California. But while the Spanish were doing that, the French were busy in the northern territories on their own missions. French missionaries managed to convert the entire Abenaki tribe in what is currently Quebec, Canada. And not only did the French convince the whole tribe to become Catholic, they also convinced them to fight against the English colonials. The British colonists in the 16th century were mainly Protestant. This was because King Henry VIII severed ties with the Roman Catholic Church in the early 16th century. England was always the outlier in Europe because of its isolation as an island. The Protestants weren't very fond of the Catholics, and they also didn't spread their Protestantism nearly as ferociously as the French Catholics in Canada. But Catholicism came to the north anyway. In the 17th century, Maryland and Pennsylvania had their own Catholics, and thanks to the French in Canada, Catholicism spread through the north as well. The most well-known atrocity of the Catholic Church in Canada involves the creation of residential schools. The Catholic Church in both the US and Canada helped push Native Americans into reserves. They segregated them from society, and in Canada, their children were forced to attend special schools. An estimated 150,000 Indigenous children were made to attend these schools with the aim of having them be assimilated into Canadian society, and this went on until the 1990s, only 30 years ago. In 2015, Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission issued a report that said Canada, as a nation, attempted to commit cultural genocide. With help from the church, they tried to eliminate the Indigenous identity and erase their culture through a process of forced assimilation. A process which would have caused the Aboriginal people to cease to exist as an independent group. Number 4. Slavery and the Church. One of the biggest players in the transatlantic slave trade was the Catholic Church. The Church was essentially the backbone of slavery in the New World. Sir John Hopkins, captain of the first ship to bring African slaves to the Americas, was devoutly Catholic. He was notorious for ensuring that his crew served God daily and loved one another. He even called his boat the good ship Jesus. John Hopkins left England for Africa in 1562, and that's when he changed history forever. Without the backing of the church, it's entirely possible that the slave trade across the Atlantic may never have happened. And without the church's help, the brutality of colonialism in Africa may not have been so unspeakably atrocious. The 5 nations that dominated the slave trade in the 17th century were predominantly Catholic. Spain, Portugal, England, France, and the Netherlands all played their part when it came to buying and selling slaves. Dr. Jonathan Chisholm from the University of Houston downtown noted that those who considered themselves good Christians were the ones who justified the enslavement of Africans. The justification was that by Christianizing African captives, they were doing them a favor. Europeans viewed them as uncivilized and thought they were doing the Lord's work by turning them into Catholics. People in the 17th century even defended slavery using the Bible, and they did this by cherry-picking pieces of religious text and twisting the message to suit their own purposes. In 1838, Jesuit priests sold 272 slaves. These priests were the ones who helped establish Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. But the school was about to suffer financial ruin, so the Catholic priests sold 272 human beings to get the funds necessary to keep the school running. And Georgetown University didn't apologize for what happened until 2016. Do you think it's fair to say that if the Catholic Church hadn't gotten involved in the slave trade, that it wouldn't have escalated as far as it did in the Americas? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And while you're at it, subscribe to the channel. Now on to number 3. Number 3, the Fourth Crusade. The Crusades may have started out with relatively pure religious intentions. The whole point of the Crusades in the beginning was to take control of the Holy Land. But by the time the Fourth Crusade came around, the whole business was terribly corrupt. Pope Innocent III initiated the Fourth Crusade in the year 1202 AD. The intent was to retake control of the city of Jerusalem, which at the time was under the control of the Muslims. But so many mistakes were made that some historians argue it wasn't even a crusade at all, and it all began in 1198 with the Pope. At the end of the Third Crusade, Richard Lionheart had struck a deal with Saladin. It was decided that Jerusalem would stay under Muslim authority, but Christians would be allowed to make pilgrimages to the city. But Pope Innocent III wanted the city to be his. So he came up with a strategy for attacking Egypt, the center of power in the Muslim world, and the best way to get there was by sea. The idea was that once the Crusaders took Egypt, they could march across to Jerusalem and recapture it by force. The issue with this, though, was economics. The Crusaders didn't have enough money, and they didn't even have a fleet of ships. So to get ships, the Crusaders agreed to capture the city of Zara from the King of Hungary. This would make Enrico Dandolo, the Doge of Venice, extremely happy, and once it was done, they would have their boats. This was done without permission from the Pope, but the Crusaders showed up anyways and ransacked the city. Before they kept on to their original goal of Egypt, though, the army was given another opportunity. Recently deposed Prince Alexios IV of Byzantium offered cash if the Crusaders could help retake Constantinople. Alexios' father, Isaac II, had been dethroned and wanted his power back. So the Crusaders agreed and assaulted Constantinople in 1203 AD. And afterward, Alexios IV was crowned Byzantine Emperor, but he didn't have money to pay the Crusaders. Emperor Alexios established a new series of taxes in an attempt to get the army their money, but the taxes sparked uprisings throughout the empire. The peasants revolted, and the emperor was murdered. And that's when the Crusaders realized they'd spent 2 years pillaging cities, and they still had no money and weren't any closer to the Holy Land. In April 1204, the Crusaders attacked Constantinople again, but this time they were angry. The Crusaders ransacked the city and massacred the citizens. They destroyed statues and stole riches. They burned libraries, and he also robbed churches. And no mercy was shown to innocent maidens either. It was horrendous, and it marked the end of the most disastrous crusade in the church's history. They never managed to retake the Holy Land, and instead, the Crusaders destroyed a holy city and slaughtered their own Catholic people. Number 2, the Doctrine of Discovery. On May 4, 1493, Pope Alexander VI issued a papal bull called Inter Cetera. This document, known as the Doctrine of Discovery, granted Spain authorization to conquer and claim new territories. It was part of Spain's strategy to establish exclusive rights over lands discovered by Christopher Columbus the previous year. The papal bull granted Spain the right to acquire all territorial possessions and land west of the Azores, and it forbade other kingdoms from touching lands west of the Azores without special permission from the Spanish king. In essence, the Vatican granted Spain a monopoly over the lands in the New World and discouraged other nations from interfering. The document stated that any non-Christian lands could be claimed, and it emphasized the expansion and spread of the Catholic faith. It expressed the idea that non-Christian nations should be overthrown and converted to Catholicism. The document essentially provided European powers with authorization to spread Christianity to new lands and subjugate non-Christian civilizations. The Doctrine of Discovery was referenced in the US Supreme Court case Johnson versus McIntosh in 1823. Chief Justice John Marshall asserted that the document granted European nations the right to claim lands in the Americas, and he further argued that Native Americans had only a right to occupy the land which could be abolished. This reference occurred nearly 400 years after the original document was issued. But even in the 19th century, the US Supreme Court was using an ancient piece of paper from Spain, signed by a long-dead pope, to justify keeping land from the Native Americans. Number 1. The Fall of Granada. The Battle of Granada took place the year before the Doctrine of Discovery was established. After several months of fighting, Granada surrendered on January 2, 1492, marking the end of Muslim rule in Spain. The combined forces of Aragon and Castile, unified under Catholicism, defeated the armies led by Sultan Boabdil, and while the campaign itself was relatively small in scale, it held great historical significance. Granada had been the last stronghold of the Moors, who'd ruled the Iberian Peninsula for 780 years. This victory was a crucial part of the Christian Reconquista, a campaign to expel Muslims and Jews from Spain. The expulsion of other religious groups aimed to establish Spain as a predominantly Catholic nation, although some Muslims and Jews chose to stay and publicly convert to Catholicism to maintain their lives in the country. However, their descendants faced difficulties as they were also banished from Spain in 1609. The fall of Granada served as a prelude to the expansion of the Spanish Empire and the spread of Catholic influence in the New World. With Granada securely under Spanish control, the king turned his attention to new horizons, and the following year, in 1492, Christopher Columbus set sail, embarking on his historic voyage. Spain's success in the Reconquista and the consolidation of power provided the resources and momentum needed to begin the process of conquering the New World. Which of the many Catholic conquests do you think was the most brutal? Let us know in the comments down below. And if you liked this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye.